Hello and welcome back to Knit and Spin If I Want To. I'm Andrea Mowry of Drea Renee Knits, and this is where I try and answer some of your questions about knitting and some spinning and life sometimes, designing, all that good stuff. I am wearing my stone crop pullover today. This is the second of the Rhinebeck sweaters that I've done with my good friends from Magpie Fibers and Spin Cycle Yarns, and it just is keeping me pretty happy today. It is sunny and cold here today, but yeah, let's go ahead and jump into some questions. So question number one today is, my question is about Spin Cycle Yarns. As you know, the spinsters recommend steam blocking for high contrast color work. Do you steam or do you wet block your pieces made with Spin Cycle? If so, what equipment do you use for steaming? If not, how do you fend off any color transfer? Thanks so much for considering my question. So, I had actually never seen that on a Spin Cycle label. But I've gotten this question a lot, and I'm like, I've never seen that. I have some right here. So let's see. For high contrast color work, we recommend steam blocking to avoid color transfer. So I just had never noticed on the label, but I would often get this question. I totally wet block. I'm trying to think. I've definitely used, for instance, my Cinnabar Shawl, which is right here. Generally speaking, I have found that a lot of indie dyers, the ways that they tend to be the most cautious with in regards to that is usually like reds. Reds seem to bleed. So this is the Cinnabar Shawl, and this uses Devilish Grin from Spin Cycle Yarns, which is really deep reds. And I paired it with their Verses, and the one I used is just this white and gray marl, and I absolutely wet blocked this, let it soak, and there is no color transfer whatsoever. That being said, I think it is always a good idea to test. I've talked about this before on here, but I have only had one occasion. My hands are really dry, so I'm just felt that. I have only had one occasion of color bleeding, which I've talked about on here. It just happened this past year, and it definitely is pretty devastating if you have put a lot of time into knitting something and then the colors bleed and it's ruined. Mine was irreparable. That happened. I had to knit a new one. So, it was not with Spin Cycle Yarns, just FYI. So I always think it's a really good idea to take some of your yarn, your swatch would be a great example, and I would throw that into some hot water and see if any bleeding happens. Or you can just throw it into a bath, however you usually block your knits. I generally use quite warm water when I'm blocking, but if you generally use cold or cool water, whatever you usually do to wet block your knits, do that with your swatch, because that's gonna tell you right away if you have to worry about bleeding. For steam blocking, there are times when steam blocking's handy, but I really don't do it a lot. But there's a couple different ways you can do steam blocking. You can either use a steamer. I have a little handheld one, but to be honest, I use it more for like sewing. And like when I don't want to have to totally iron out my fabric when I've just washed it, sometimes I'll like do a quick steam on an area that maybe got wrinkled when it was folded up. But by the way, this is great. This is the Knitter's Wrist Relief from Farmer's Daughter Fibers. But another way you can do it is if you just have your regular old iron, you would take your knit and put it out onto a heat-proof surface. You could put it on an ironing board, you could put it on some clean towels, but you want to lay your knit out, and then you would put a damp towel on top, and the towel needs to be damp enough so that it can put steam into your knit. You don't want it sopping wet, but it should be damp, and then you can just set the iron on there for a good and let it kind of steam in. And it's actually a really fabulous way to block out some things if you don't want to do a full wet block, because it should give it enough steam that it is going to help the yarn bloom. Maybe not as much as with a wet block, but it should still get a nice bloom, and it will definitely help it relax, so that if it's like, say, a shawl or something you want to be able to pin out more, that you should be able to do that. So that is how I would steam block, but in general, I am pro wet block all the way, and will generally just do that. And again, if I was worried about color bleeding, I would do a test before I ever put my finished object into the bath, especially now. All right, so question number 2. I am a longtime knitter of hats, shawls, scarves, and other accessories. In the past 2 years, I've ventured into sweater knitting with mixed success. Most recently, I completed a cardigan that I knit in a smooth superwash nylon DK yarn. My swatch was washed and blocked, 2 gauge. They did a 5 by 5 inch swatch, and it matched both stitch and row gauge perfectly. Good job, that is rare. However, after knitting and blocking, the cardigan sleeves have grown a lot, like 3 inches longer than expected. I expected some growth to the superwash yarn, but it's like the weight of the stitches have pulled on the sleeves even more. Is there anything I can do to avoid this or fix it? Barring frogging the lower part of the sleeve and trying again. I'm a mom to 3 littles, and it's so frustrating to have my time and money spent on unpredictable results. So, yeah, it's tough because you did a good size swatch, you blocked it and everything, and then you still had the surprise at the end. And this is where some people feel that swatches lie. Unfortunately, swatches can only tell us so much when we are going to be knitting a project that is much larger than they are. And I think where it really happens is in something like a sweater with superwash yarn that's been worsted spun. So the thing about a lot of these beautiful superwash indie dyed yarns that are like really smooth and soft, they generally are merino, they oftentimes have some nylon in them, is they're heavy. You know, a single skein might not feel that heavy, but when you have knit that up into a sweater, they're heavy. And so, yeah. Sorry, I'm wiggling my foot and I just realized I was wiggling that. I would, for your sweater, I'm hoping maybe you knit it from the top down. I would go back and I would unravel a couple inches of your sleeve and reknit the cuff. I think it's gonna go way faster than you might think. It only takes a second to frog, and you will then wear that sweater and be so much happier with it. Obviously, if you knit them from the cuff up, that gets a little trickier. But I do think going back and fixing our knits is really important, because you did put so much time and money into that knit. And if the only issue with it is that those sleeves are a bit too long, I would fix them, because then you're gonna get to wear them and it's gonna make that time really worth it. And fixing it will be such a small amount of time compared to what you've already put into that sweater. I also wouldn't be opposed, for me personally, to cuffing I don't know how long your ribbing is, but you could consider cuffing the sleeve, just folding it back, depending on if that will help shorten them enough so that it doesn't bother you. But generally, superwash yarns that are worsted spun and knit into a sweater, especially DK or worsted weight, they are gonna grow, and it can be a couple inches. The only thing I can say is knitting a bigger swatch. But another thing you could try, I do think it's smart to knit a 6 by 6 inch swatch for sweaters. Some designers I know even say 8 by 8. that is a lot of fabric. So I understand why people don't want to do that. I think it's even less about the knitting and more about like that yarn usage. So I understand that. But another thing you could try doing that I have heard recommended is you could hang your swatch to dry. So hanging, especially, and I would, especially in regards to the specific yarn we're talking about here, I do think it's a good idea because it is gravity and the weight of the yarn that made it grow. It also narrows up your gauge. So I've had that happen with sleeves where then it really narrowed the sleeve and made the sleeve just a little too snug, where it wasn't like super comfortable anymore compared to if that sleeve hadn't grown in the way it did, which compressed my stitch gauge and stretched my row gauge. So that's what I would recommend. I would recommend fixing your cardi so you love it, and then next time hang that swatch to dry. Because that will at least allow it to represent a little bit of that force of gravity that you might see. You know what else you could do in the future too, is if you're knitting it top down, I would recommend before you do your cuffs, even your hem, depending on if you have, some of us don't mind some extra length in the body. I can't handle a lot of length in the body because my torso is super short. So if sweaters hit me like just a little bit too long, I don't feel comfortable in them. So I would recommend this too for the body if that's an issue for you. But you can just throw that sweater on to some waist yarn before you do cuffs and hem, wet block it, and then try it on. And if you're like, sweet, this is perfect, I need about 1 inch more, I need 2 inches more, that's how long I'm gonna make my cuff and hem, and I know it's gonna be perfect and I'm gonna love it. Or, oh wow, this is already where I want it to end, I'm gonna go ahead and just tear back 1 inch and knit my cuff, and then you're done, and you don't have to guess, because again, swatches are limiting. They can only tell us so much in comparison to how big of a project we may be knitting with them. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope you can make your cardi perfect for you because you're worth it. All right, next question. I've knit pullovers with raglan increases before, but I'm knitting my first circular yoke, and the increases are stressing me out. The increases are evenly spaced out in a round and repeat after a certain number of rounds. I'm noticing slight puckering in the increase rounds. It's not massively noticeable, but my very perfectionist personality is making it hard to ignore. Is the puckering from knitting too tightly or too loosely? Does it just block out after the sweater is done? So where I tend to see the difference between that raglan and that round yoke is raglans have this nice line where all the increases are placed, and you're never increasing generally more than 8 to 16 stitches per, let's say, row or round in a raglan. Sometimes you do have them stacked to get it to be a little bit broader once you get to the chest right before the underarm. That can be common in a raglan pattern. But generally speaking, it's 8 stitches per row or round. And in a round yoke sweater, you might increase as much as 100 stitches in one round. And that is part of it, is when they are knit from the top down, a really common increase to use in round yoke sweaters is a lifted increase. So a lot of times we do a make one right or a make one left, and we're actually taking the bar that connects 2 stitches, that strand, and we're lifting it up. So if you have to, and then we knit into it. So we're pulling on it. So if you have to do that quite rapidly in one round, if you have to do a lot of those, that whole strand of yarn, that's all connected, and now it's being pulled quite a bit all around. So that's what might be causing some of your puckering. So it's not necessarily something you are doing wrong. It's not necessarily too tight or too loose. It's the nature of what we're asking our yarn to do, where it was at like this perfectly nice tension, and now we're adding more tension to it by pulling it up and trying to knit new stitches into it. I would actually say that's one of the cons of knitting a top-down yoke compared to a bottom-up, because bottom-up we decrease, and I think that can be much smoother. Ways to combat that, I actually have a tutorial for this, but I would only recommend it, like I used it in my throwback cardigan, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend throwing it willy-nilly into any yoke pattern anytime, because if it's not in the instance I use it for, you could end up with holes. So what I would do is I would go ahead, and this would be a great time to maybe try out steam blocking, and steam block out that yoke. You don't have to do a full wet block, but just steam block it out and see if it smooths out. And that might help you relax, because it should. A lot of times that puckering goes away unless it really was increased too rapidly. But I think that if you steam block it out, you might see that it's going to completely disappear, and then it won't be stressing you out while you're knitting. So that is what I would do. All right. I've been knitting the DRK everyday sock pattern for about a year, and it's become my go-to. Yay! I love the pattern, and I love using my hand spun for socks. Me too. I'm curious if you've experimented with adding reinforcement on the heel, such as adding a strand of mohair or silk or nylon thread in just that section. I'm a little worried the stockinette stitch may wear through over time, but you never talk about that being an issue. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. So, of course, the other day I had like all of my DRK everyday socks up here, and now I don't have any of them up here. But I believe what this knitter is asking about is on the DRK everyday socks, those are ribbed socks, but the back heel, there's a cute little triangle of stockinette. Generally speaking, I've never rubbed a hole into that area on a sock. If I'm gonna see wear and tear on the heel, it's more on either the base of the heel or right at the curve. I've never, where that triangle ends up is actually kind of where the foot almost does this a little bit, right above that heel. So no, I've never had a problem with it, and I've never reinforced it. If you, because all feet are different and we wear out socks differently. We've had a discussion about this before, because my husband, for instance, wears through socks like there is no tomorrow, which we had, so if you can go back and find that episode, if you just search like I'll knit if I want to, or Andrea Mowry, and put in something about socks, it'll pull up like all the episodes where I happen to talk about that. So just a good way in general, if you're trying to see if I've answered what your question may be, you can try doing that and popping it into the YouTube search engine, and it'll pull up some videos. Anyways, we got some really interesting feedback from other people who have had issues wearing through socks and what that might be, like everything from high arches to needing a pedicure, and our feet are a little more calloused and rubbing through our socks faster, which I totally think might be part of Peter's problem. And I was like, oh, I think you need a pedicure. So yes, if you have worn through that part of a sock before, there's no reason not to reinforce it. Go ahead and give it a go. But I have not found it necessary. And in a little bit, I'll also talk about, there is a knit along right now for that sock pattern. So if you want to join in on the fun, I'll chat about that a little bit at the end. All right. I love the texture of brioche. I do too. It's squishy. I have some right here. I have a question. When I blocked my ramble shawl, it seemed like I must have done something wrong, because the depth of the brioche stitches seemed to disappear and the fabric flattened out a lot. Is that normal, or did I stretch it too much when I blocked it, or something else? Blocking made it so different that I might not want to block the next FO, finished object, so I can make sure to keep the depth of this gorgeous brioche stitches. Thanks for any brioche tips about this. So I loved this question. This is something that I usually always talk about when I teach brioche. So there's two camps of brioche lovers, I find. There's us briochers who knit it because we love the squish of it. Like the deeper, squishier, plumper we can get the brioche, the better. People who really like it as kind of like a ribbing. And then there are the brioche lovers. I'm gonna see if I have my ramble shawl. I do. So this is the shawl in question. You may recognize it because it was on my mannequin that used to live back there forever, and I had so many questions about like, what is that shawl? So this is the Ramble shawl, and it is knit up in North Light fibers. What's the specific name of the yarn? I'm not gonna remember. It's on the pattern page. I'll link to the pattern. But it is a cashmere blend, and it is so soft. So anyways, this is, I think, the other camp of briochers who love like using it with contrast and doing lots of increasing and decreasing, so it has like the beautiful motifs that look like lace and cables, and they want to see it be open to really show the two different colors they used. So it really, blocking, absolutely, I'll give some tips for that, but it's also your gauge. So general rule of thumb, even if you are the tightest knitter in your knitting group with brioche, you will be looser, significantly looser. And that's just the nature of the fabric. So when we knit brioche, we place a yarn over around every other stitch as we work, and that creates a looser fabric. So it is really common that most people need to size down for whatever yarn they're using compared to if they were just knitting stockinette or garter stitch. This is so soft. So if you are somebody who you want it to stay really squishy and plump and like puffy, then I recommend going down a needle size, maybe even beyond what the pattern calls for, as long as it's not going to affect the final fit of what you might be trying to knit. But like the Ramble shawl, you absolutely could size down after you finish the garter portion of the shawl. And I've actually recommended that to knitters who have emailed me with like, oh, I feel like my brioche looks sloppy. And generally that's their gauge is just too loose. So consider going down needle sizes, and you can really kind of push it. You'd be surprised how low you can go on your needle size compared to the weight of yarn you're using. And then for blocking, you really do have to be careful with blocking brioche, especially if you're using a superwash yarn. Brioche wants to grow. Think of it as an accordion that just wants to like open up. It's a really expansive fabric, which can make it beautiful. It's why I love it so much for shawls. All of these shawls have brioche because I love it. So it makes it great for like drapey fabric, but it does mean that it wants to open up. So if you are very concerned about it, I do love a wet block on brioche because, man, when you see that yarn bloom and fill in and kind of puff up with the ribbing, it's so, so beautiful. So what I do is I am really extra special careful when I'm getting my brioche knit out of the bath. You know, I really make sure I don't let any of it like flop out of my arm and stretch, because yarn can hold so much water weight. So I'm really careful about trying to squeeze out as much moisture as possible. When I have it rolled up in towels, I try really hard to make sure that I'm not going to roll it in a way where it's going to stretch it out. Same with pinning it out, laying it flat to dry. And another thing is too, is when we're blocking, don't be afraid to smush it and like zhuzh it back into a more compact space. You don't have to spread everything out. And with knitting, it's kind of amazing how you can kind of like smush, 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 and it'll dry and kind of like and be closer to maybe the outcome you want to have. I hope this is making sense. So anyways, definitely pay attention to blocking. Pay attention to your yarn choices. So again, if you're knitting like a really drapey, beautiful, flowy shawl, have fun with those like hand-dyed, indie, speckly, fun, superwash yarns. But if you want it to have stability, if you want it to act like ribbing, if you are knitting a hat, I highly recommend then going to something that's toothsome, that's got some grip. And you're gonna find that a lot more in like your woolly wools and non-super washed wools, because that still has the scales on each individual fiber and it wants to grab onto itself. So like Brooklyn tweed is a great example off the top of my head there, especially Shelter, Quarry, and Loft, because it's such a nice grabby kind of sticky yarn, and it blooms and puffs so beautifully with blocking. So that would be another thing to consider. Is it definitely your yarn choice and your blocking method and your needle size all will affect the outcome of that brioche. All right. I've never spun a true sweater's quantity for a sweater. Most of my hand spun skeins have become objects of art or decorations. I would like to spin to knit your nurtured sweater. I am curious if your hand spun matched the Julie Asselin yarn called for in the pattern perfectly. No, it did not. Or did you knit a different size to match your yarn gauge? No, I did not. Also, how did you know how much fiber you needed to start with? I guessed. I'm really curious about the yarn you spun. Specifically, how many plies did you use? 2. Did you swatch as you were spinning? I did not. Or at the end when you had finished spinning all the yarn? Okay, there's so many questions here. I might have a skein of it. So just pretend like I'm still sitting there talking to you about some yarn. La la la. In this bucket. No. Darn. I just made like the biggest mess over there. And I wish I had someone to clean it up for me. I just pulled all the yarn out. I don't have that yarn over there. So let's kind of slow down and answer and actually properly answer these questions. So let's start with quantity of fiber. I did not know how much to buy. I did ask my friend Casey from Port Fiber, and she kind of helped guide me. I had also looked online, and there's kind of a rule of thumb that says 2 pounds of fiber for a sweater. And obviously that can vary drastically. I've worn my hand spun DRK everyday sweater a few times, and I think that was only like, I don't know, 9 ounces or something. Crazy. I was looking to see if I have my notes there, but I don't. So like, it can obviously vary drastically, but that's meant to be like a safe kind of guideline of like buy 2 pounds. So I did not know how much to buy. I kind of winged that. I don't think I bought a full 2 pounds, but it might have been close. And I had some left over. I did not match that yarn. Nurtured from Julie Asselin is a pretty dense yarn, even though I believe it is woolen spun. It's a heavier yarn, I found. And I cannot even tell you how many plies that yarn has off the top of my head. But I just did a 2 ply because that is where, I mean, I had just learned to spin. So like, I don't even think I was to the point of thinking about more than 2 plies. And 2 plies is really nice for, you know, a lot of people consider that like jumper yarn, sweater yarn is a 2 ply yarn. So that worked out great. And I now that I know better would absolutely do some sampling. That's what I've done for one of my most recent sweater spins. Is I actually spun it up a couple different ways, just enough where I could then do like ply a little bit to knit a little swatch and kind of gauge like, okay, do I like the thickness this yarn is? Do I like how it looks knit up in the swatch? Do I want to do a 2 ply or a 3 ply? Even with my sweater spin I did last year, which is my most favorite yarn I've ever spun, I actually waited to do that till the end. So I spun up, I think I just knew I was at a point where I still just needed to like allow, especially to attempt to maintain my consistency over the amount I was spinning. I just stuck with my default yarn. I just let myself spin the thickness that was comfortable for me with that fiber. And then at the end is what I chose when I chose how many plies I wanted to do. So I did a 2 ply and a 3 ply, and then I knit up little swatches of each. And then I decided, okay, now I know I want to do this all 3 ply. And so that's what I did. So yeah, a lot of thought did not go in to when I spun for my nurtured sweater. I I guess I got kind of lucky with that yarn gauge. I knit the same size I knit for my original sample and did not fiddle with anything. I probably once, you know what might have happened is I bet I spun up all that yarn thinking I'm gonna knit a sweater, and then I spun it up and was like, oh, this is gonna be perfect for another nurtured, like based on the yarn I ended up with. Might have been how it went for me at that time. Can't really remember. I might have just wanted another nurtured. I don't remember. Is the honest answer there. So now knowing what I know, I would recommend you do some sampling so that you are actually getting the yarn you want. Nurtured, I think you could do a 2 or a 3 ply and it's gonna be okay with the texture of that sweater. I think you'd be fine with either. And for the sampling, so what I would do is I would start spinning and I would get to kind of a comfortable place where it feels really natural, and then I would do a ply back and see how you like that thickness of that yarn, the amount of twist that's in it. I would also, you can fold it over once more to see what it might look like as a 3 ply in your ply back. But then I would do maybe spin up just a little bit and ply it up and then knit that and make sure you like it, and then it's going to get you close to the gauge you want to knit the sweater at. I did, yeah, I think that was all of it. So yeah, it was pretty willy-nilly for me. I really do try to let my creativity lead me. When I start trying to fit myself into a box, it can be a joy sucker for me. So I tend to kind of need to be able to like spin for the love of it. But now that I'm starting to understand all those puzzle pieces, that stuff's becoming a lot more fun for me. I'm actually enjoying some of that fiddly beginning work to really get the spin I want is becoming part of the creative process that I don't know that it would have been for me in the first year or two of spinning. So it's evolved very slowly for me and very naturally, which has been nice. My radiator is about to get real noisy back there, so sorry y'all. Okay, let's keep going. I am a beginner in spinning. I do spin consistent thickness, but I would like to know how to aim for certain thickness at the end. I mean, if I would like the end result to be sport weight, how do you know what thickness or reps per inch should I make the single ply? I am referring to 2 ply. Same goes if I want fingering weight. What would be the thickness of your single ply? Thanks in advance. So a lot of this, so to change the thickness of the yarn you're spinning, all it is adding more fiber or adding less fiber. That's what controls your thickness as far as your singles. Aside from that, it's plies. So what I did early in my spinning is I spun the singles that felt good for me, and then I got the thickness of yarn I wanted by deciding how many plies to use in the finished yarn. So that's how I kind of did like a little workaround there, is I was like, I'm just gonna spin the singles that feel really good. And then if I want a little bit of a finer yarn, I'm gonna make it a 2 ply. Or if I want it to be thicker, I'm gonna make it a 3 ply. And that worked for me because I wasn't necessarily using my hand spun yarn for projects that were like, the plies were gonna make or break what I was knitting with stitch definition and things like that. But I have watched quite a few tutorials, and really what it comes down to is by trying to make those plies thinner or thicker, you need to pinch out more or less fiber as you're drafting. As far as knowing how thick it's going to be with your finished plied yarn, that's where a ply back sample I think is really helpful. And I think part of it's very intuitive for me because I have done things like playing around with holding yarns together. So if you kind of have any basic knowledge of like when I hold 2 strands of fingering weight together, that gives me almost like a DK. So if you're trying to go for a DK weight while spinning and you want it to be two ply, you would want the thickness of your single ply to be about that of a fingering weight yarn. You know what I'm saying? So I think part's been kind of intuitive for me. And I think that once you have done a few, it becomes easier to just visually be like, okay, this is looking pretty good I know if I do it this fine for 3 plies, like for my socks for the knit along that I'm doing right now, I know that's gonna give me a pretty solid fingering weight. My default yarns tend to be fingering and sport weight. So, and yeah, default yarns, for anyone who watched the episode where I could not remember what that was called, it's now in here real good. So that's naturally where I kind of land, and those tend to be my favorite yarns to knit with. It's like a fingering or a sport weight. So I don't think I also put too much brain effort into making that happen. But there you go. I hope others will chime in. I'm sure there's better, more like real solid tips on how to determine all that, but that's what I do. Okay, so let's talk about the knit along. So I did a little video for this. I will link that below, but we are doing a DRK spin it to knit it knit along, where we are spinning yarn for the DRK everyday socks. Here's my first bobbin here. I'm using Akara Yarns 100% Dorset in Peacock. So I made this little Ravelry forum. We're also using a hashtag on Instagram if you just want to participate there. So I will add all the links and everything right below. But we are just going to spin up some sock yarn and knit some socks together. And if you're not a spinner, you can still 100% join and just join for the knitting fun of it. You don't have to spin your own yarn. But I needed a little palette cleanser. I needed to do a smaller project in between these sweater spins I'm doing, and decided to spin for socks. And so I put out a little call last week asking if anyone wanted to join me, and a bunch of you did. So the forums are already blowing up with all kinds of really fun chitter chatter, and I hope you'll join us because it's super fun and it just feels so good to be spinning and knitting with some friends from all over the place. There's people from all different countries joining in, and it's super fun. In other spinning news, I am almost done with my shawl design using my hand spun. Here's a little sneak peek. I have had so much fun with this, knitting this. I mean, look at that. That makes me so happy. So I've shown little peeks of this before, but this was basically, this is some undyed Cormo in like a white and a beige marl. This is a fingering weight. And this, I never pull from the middle. If you know me, I have talked about this. I am not a center pull person. I always pull from the outside. But the color I wanted to start with was on the inside. So I'm dealing with this flaccid cake of yarn that is vomiting at me all the time. But this is Hedgehog Fibers from their Fiber Club. And I basically took like an entire subscription of the club and divided it into blues and pinks-ish. And then just made little nests of the fiber and then put them all in a basket and just spun them. And then I turned that into a 2-ply yarn. And so this is a sport weight. And so I am using these two. I love the neutrality that this undyed is bringing to my really fun, bright, all over the place skein over here. I just love how they're mixing together. So I can't put it down. It's like every row, I'm like, what's gonna happen now? It's like a choose your own adventure shawl. It is so much fun. But I'm also dreaming up some options for commercial yarn. So again, don't worry if you don't spin yarn. You can absolutely, I'll have some commercial options of yarns you can buy when I'm ready to publish the shawl. But I have to say spinning this reminded me of when I knit Find Your Fade. And I just started it as a creativity experiment. I just wanted to see what would happen. All the fiber looked so beautiful together, even though it was all drastically different. Like one bag of the fiber was quite tweedy. Another had a bunch of silk in it, which, by the way, silk is very challenging for me to spin. And it was just all over the place. And I loved how some of the colors were like deep and moody, like there was some blacks in there, and then others were like really vibrant and bright. And I just had so much fun not kind of stressing over what was going to happen, not trying to control the color. And I think that's just part of who I am. I try really hard in my knitting. That's why I love spin cycle yarns. That's why I loved fading, is I try to just enjoy what's going to happen with the yarn. Like I'll never forget the first time I knit with speckles, and it was just like, oh, there's another little pop like that you don't expect, you can't plan it, and it just comes across your needles, and it's just like this little joyful like, hey there. So anyways, it's just been super fun, and I really encourage anyone out there to try playing with spinning some yarn and knitting with it and just seeing what happens. And thank you so much to everyone who chimed in last week on spindle spinning. It was so fun to hear everyone's experiences, how it's very different from spinning on a wheel, but how a lot of people felt like it did make wheel spinning easier for them when they were ready to take that leap. Or I think there was even one person who started on a wheel and kind of struggled with it and then tried a spindle, and that ended up making it easier for her when she went back to her wheel. All the different kinds of spindles. It was just really, really fun to read everyone who left their experiences. So thank you everyone who jumped into the comments and shared. It's my favorite thing. It's why I wanted to do this little spin it to knit along, because especially being back in that newbie place, it's so valuable when people are willing to share what they've learned and their experiences and their tips and tricks. And it is one of the things that I realize I'm really missing during these past couple years of just being more isolated and not really seeing anyone. You know, we moved to a new state right before the pandemic hit. And so it's been a lonely couple years. We didn't really have time to get out there much. And we're pretty introverted and shy and stay at home people anyways. But I've really been feeling it lately that I just miss that connection and that excitement when you're in a craft or whatever it is, but just that thing that like fires you up and you're just so excited to talk about it. And then you meet other people that like share that, and you can just, I think especially as somebody who's very, you know, I'm very anxious and socially anxious and shy and introverted and sensitive. And so socializing doesn't always come easy for me, but there is something so special when you do have this thing that you love so much. And even though putting yourself out there can feel really scary and vulnerable, when you do come across other people that share that and how it makes something that's not always easy for you in life all of a sudden so much easier because you have this common language. And it's just like finding one of your own, and it feels so good. So anyways, I'm gonna end it here, but thank you so much again for all of you who are joining me here weekly. For those of you who've just found it, I really appreciate you submitting your questions and chiming in the comments and just hanging out with me every weekend. It's been really such a lovely addition to my life. So thank you so much, and I'll see you here next week. Bye.